Before we jump into the story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It started with something so small, so seemingly trivial, that even now, as I reflect on it, it's hard to believe that such a fleeting moment could unravel everything. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those quiet moments in the house where time seemed to slow down. I was standing in the living room, sorting through a pile of laundry, carefully folding towels, as I always did. The hum of the washing machine and the soft rustle of fabric were the only sounds in the room, creating a peaceful rhythm. Then, from the hallway, I heard Ethan's voice break through the calm. "Claire, can you give me a hand with this?" I paused, my hands stilling on the towels as I turned toward the sound of his voice. Ethan was standing by the stairs, looking somewhat flustered, his hands fumbling with the buckle of his belt. He was dressed in a pair of khaki shorts that hung low on his hips, the fabric slightly wrinkled, and he seemed to be struggling with the belt. The leather strap twisted awkwardly in his hands, and it was clear he was having trouble. "Can you fix this? It's stuck or something?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration as he walked toward me. "Sure," I replied, setting the folded towels aside on the couch. I pushed myself to my feet and stepped toward him, my mind already on the simple task at hand. But as I approached, I couldn't help but notice the way he was holding his belt, the small tension in his posture, and I wondered why such a small thing had thrown him off so much. Reaching for the belt, I gently tried to untangle the strap from the buckle, focusing on the leather's stubborn twists. "Hold still," I mumbled to myself, concentrating on the movement of my hands. The leather felt stiff, and the buckle wouldn't budge. "Yes, sorry," Ethan replied, his voice softening as he held his breath, as if hoping his stillness might make things easier. He stood unnaturally still, his gaze flickering to the floor, then to me, then back down to his hands as I worked. But as I pulled at the belt once more, trying to free it from the buckle, the leather suddenly gave way, and before either of us could react, the shorts, his khaki shorts, slipped all the way down to his ankles, leaving him standing there in nothing but his boxers. For a brief, suspended moment, the world seemed to freeze. It was as though the air in the room thickened, and time stretched out far longer than it had any right to. My eyes, against every instinct I tried to control, flickered downward just for a second. It was a reflex, something I couldn't stop myself from doing, and in that instant I saw everything. I saw more than I intended, more than I wanted to, and my heart skipped a beat before I quickly turned away, my face flaming with embarrassment. Ethan stood completely still, frozen in place, his hands awkwardly hovering by his sides, as if unsure where to put them. His face turned a shade of crimson, and I could see his breath quicken, his body tensing in the aftermath of what had just happened. Sorry," he muttered barely above a whisper, his voice filled with discomfort as he hastily yanked his shorts back up, his face still a brilliant red. I stepped back, my cheeks burning with the sudden heat of the situation. "It's fine," I said quickly, my voice strained as I tried to sound nonchalant. "It happens," but I couldn't stop the awkwardness from settling between us, the air now thick with tension that neither of us knew how to address. "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice tight, clearly still embarrassed. "Thanks, for the help." He quickly turned and hurried upstairs, leaving me standing there, frozen in place, my mind racing, my heart still hammering in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that this accidental moment of clumsiness had somehow altered the dynamic between us. It had been just an accident, a fleeting, awkward incident that would likely have gone unnoticed if we had both been strangers. But we weren't. We were family, and that made it different. The room felt heavier now, the silence between us filled with the weight of something unspoken. I couldn't help but notice how his eyes lingered on mine for just a fraction of a second longer before he turned away. It wasn't much, just a moment, but it felt like a turning point. Neither of us spoke about it. Not then, not after, but from that moment on, everything between Ethan and I changed in ways I couldn't have predicted. And even though we both tried to pretend nothing was different, we both knew that it was. My marriage to Mark had never been a whirlwind romance, the kind of love story you see in movies. It wasn't bad either, it was just there, quiet, comfortable, but also slowly losing its warmth. We'd married later in life, when I was 44 and Mark was 50, both of us coming off the pain of failed first marriages. We were two people who'd learned to settle into a quieter kind of companionship, one that didn't necessarily need passion to survive. Mark was a man of routines. He thrived on predictability, golf on Saturdays, fishing trips once a month, and an endless series of client dinners that kept him out late more often than not. It was the life we had built together. Predictable, reliable, but over the years increasingly hollow. I had come to accept the long silences between us, filling my days with charity work, gardening, and keeping the house in order. It was a way of keeping the quiet from suffocating me. But then Ethan moved in, Mark's son from his first marriage. I had always known about him, of course, but the relationship between us had always been polite, distant, and occasionally awkward. In the early years of my marriage, when Ethan was still in college, I'd only seen him a handful of times during the obligatory holiday visits. Back then, he was a shy, reserved young man, awkward in the way most young men are when forced into proximity with a new stepmother. I could never quite shake the feeling that he was just tolerating me, going through the motions of familial duty. But 6 years later, when Ethan showed up on our doorstep, he was no longer the shy teenager I remembered. He had changed, grown. He was a man now, though still grappling with finding his place in the world. He had recently graduated, but his degree in fine arts, something Mark had always rolled his eyes at, hadn't led to the kind of success he had hoped for. Mark, ever the pragmatist, had offered him a place to stay while he figured things out. I hadn't been consulted about the decision, but I didn't object. The house was large enough to accommodate him, and to be honest, I didn't mind the idea of some company during the long days when Mark was busy with work or out with his friends. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly Ethan's presence would change the atmosphere in our home. He had this easy charm about him, the kind of natural charisma that made people feel comfortable around him. His humor was dry but disarming, his smile infectious, and his presence seemed to fill the empty spaces of the house in a way that Mark never did. Ethan had recently graduated, but despite the promise of a fine arts degree, he was struggling to find his place in the world. His degree, something Mark still couldn't quite understand or appreciate, hadn't led to any immediate career opportunities. Mark, ever the practical one, offered him a place to stay while he figured things out. I wasn't consulted about this decision. It wasn't something we discussed or planned, but I didn't object. The house was large enough to accommodate him. And if I'm being honest, I didn't mind the idea of having some company during those long days when Mark was buried at work or out with his friends. What I didn't anticipate, however, was how quickly Ethan's presence would begin to shift the energy of the house. He had this effortless ease about him, a kind of natural charisma that made him easy to be around. Unlike Mark, who was comfortable in his routines but often felt emotionally distant, Ethan had a way of filling the spaces in a room, not just physically, but emotionally too. His humor was dry but disarming, his smile infectious, and there was a warmth about him that made the house feel alive in a way it hadn't in a long time. It was subtle at first, a soft undercurrent, but it didn't take long before I realized just how much his presence had changed the atmosphere of our home. It all started with small moments, those little exchanges that, when strung together, can quietly transform a relationship. One morning, I was outside trimming the hedges in the backyard when Ethan wandered out, barefoot and still groggy from sleep, holding a cup of coffee. His tousled hair and the soft glow of the morning light made him look almost otherworldly, a lazy smile playing on his lips as he leaned against the patio door, watching me work. "You're up early," I remarked, pausing for a moment to glance over at him. He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving me. "Couldn't sleep. Besides, someone has to admire all the work you're putting in out here." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Don't let Mark hear you say that. He thinks this garden just takes care of itself." Ethan's smile widened, and he leaned back, his posture casual but observant. "Mark doesn't notice much," he said, his tone light, but with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. The comment caught me off guard, but I chose not to press him on it. Instead, I returned to trimming the hedges, my mind buzzing with the unspoken words hanging in the air between us. As much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't help but notice how his eyes lingered on me, how the casual, almost carefree nature of his presence began to feel different. Over the weeks that followed, our interactions grew more frequent and more natural. We started to fall into a steady rhythm. Ethan would linger in the kitchen while I cooked, chatting about his college days and his dreams, or asking for advice on job applications. Sometimes it felt like I was more of a mentor than a stepmother, a role I hadn't expected to assume, but somehow it felt right. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. One afternoon, I walked into the living room to find Ethan sprawled out on the couch, sketching in a notebook. His legs were stretched out lazily, and he seemed completely absorbed in whatever he was working on, his pencil moving rapidly across the page. The sight of him in that relaxed state, so immersed in his world, piqued my curiosity. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked, nodding toward the notebook resting on his lap. He hesitated for a brief moment, his fingers hovering over the pages as if reluctant to share. But then he handed it to me, his expression unreadable. The pages were filled with intricate pencil sketches, portraits, landscapes, abstract designs, all of them alive with movement and detail. Something was captivating about them. The way his drawings seemed to pulse with emotion, even though they were still images. "These are incredible," I said, my voice genuinely impressed. "You've got real talent, Ethan." He gave a modest shrug, his voice quieter now. "Thanks. It's just something I do to pass the time." But I could see the hesitance in his eyes, as though he didn't fully believe in his talent, as though the idea of sharing these sketches with anyone, let alone a gallery or an art director, was something he hadn't considered. "You should show these to someone," I said, feeling a surge of confidence on his behalf. "A gallery, an art director. You have real talent, Ethan." He looked at me for a moment, studying my face as if weighing my words. "Yeah, maybe," he said slowly, almost as if he was talking himself into it. "I don't know. I've never really thought about it that way. Just something I do when I need to clear my head." There was a quiet vulnerability in his voice, an openness that was rare for him. And as I handed the notebook back to him, I couldn't help but feel a strange shift in the air between us. We were no longer just stepmother and stepson. There was an unspoken connection forming, one built on these quiet, intimate exchanges that seemed to carry more weight than I initially realized. But even as I recognized this, I couldn't ignore the deeper undercurrent of discomfort beginning to stir within me. Something had changed, and as much as I tried to push it aside, the way Ethan began to fill the gaps in my life, the way his presence made the house feel alive in ways Mark never did, was becoming harder and harder to ignore. What had started as a simple act of hospitality, offering Ethan a place to stay, was now something more, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. He smiled faintly, his eyes locking with mine for a brief moment. "You're the first person who's ever said that." The weight of his words settled between us, unspoken but undeniable. There was something in the way he said it, so vulnerable yet hopeful, that made my chest tighten. I didn't know what to make of it, and it left me with a fluttering unease I couldn't quite name. I wanted to say something, anything to alleviate the strange tension between us, but before I could, the belt incident happened and everything shifted. For days afterward, the air between us felt suffocating, thick with a tension neither of us seemed equipped to address. We moved around each other like strangers, careful and distant, though the closeness of the house made avoidance nearly impossible. The silence was louder than any conversation we might have had. Every accidental brush of the shoulder, every moment of eye contact, fraught with the weight of what had passed between us. I did my best to avoid being alone with him, but it was futile. The house, once a sanctuary of routine and familiarity, now felt like a minefield, and every step was a risk. One evening, as I stood at the sink, washing dishes, I heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Ethan came into the kitchen, his hair damp from a recent shower, still dripping slightly onto his shoulders. He looked every bit like someone caught between worlds, his youthful features softened by the water droplets, his eyes avoiding mine. "Claire," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. My heart skipped a beat at the way he said my name, with that delicate, almost reverent tone. I turned slightly, the rhythm of the dishwashing faltering for a moment as I tried to steady myself. "Yes," I responded, my voice betraying the sudden flutter in my chest. I didn't want to meet his gaze, but I couldn't look away. He shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his jeans, the fabric of his shirt slightly pulled up by the movement, revealing the smooth line of his waist. "About the other day? I'm sorry. That was awkward." I felt the rush of heat in my cheeks, and I quickly turned back to the sink, avoiding his eyes. "It's fine," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Let's just forget about it." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were hollow, a half-truth. I wanted to forget, yes, but I couldn't. Ethan's silence filled the space between us for a moment before he spoke again. His voice, even quieter this time, barely above a whisper. "I don't think I can." The words landed on me like a heavy stone. I froze, the dish in my hand slipping from my grasp for just a moment before I caught it again. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears as I slowly turned to face him. His expression was earnest and intense, and the weight of his gaze made it difficult to breathe. "Ethan," I began, the words slipping from me like sand through my fingers. "We can't," but the sentence trailed off, unfinished, because I didn't know how to finish it. I didn't know how to tell him that this was something we couldn't explore, that the line between what was acceptable and what was not had been crossed, but even that was blurry now. He stepped closer, closing the small distance between us with a slow, deliberate step. His eyes were unwavering, filled with something deeper than I had expected. "I know," he said, his voice so steady, it felt like it might break me. I don't want you to think it didn't mean anything to me." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of unsaid things. His voice, intense and raw, left me speechless. I could feel the ache of his sincerity, the weight of something unspoken, something we both knew but couldn't yet admit. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the room charged with the electricity of the moment, neither of us moving. Then, from somewhere beyond the kitchen, I heard Mark's voice, loud, oblivious, calling out from the front door. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. "I'll be right there," I said quickly, almost too quickly before turning away from Ethan. The movement felt forced, as though I was trying to physically distance myself from whatever was happening between us. But even as I walked away, I knew something had shifted. The spell that had bound us at that moment had been broken, but it had left a mark, something that couldn't be undone. The following days passed in a blur of avoidance. We tiptoed around each other, both of us silently acknowledging the rift without acknowledging it aloud. Mark, as always, remained blissfully unaware, retreating to the television or heading out with his friends, leaving me and Ethan to navigate the quiet tension in the house. It was a delicate dance, and neither of us knew how to step around it without stumbling. Then, one afternoon, as I folded laundry in the guest room, I heard a soft knock at the door. I looked up to find Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression tentative and uncertain. He seemed a little more grown up than I remembered, his posture more mature, but still carrying that air of vulnerability I'd seen before. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure whether he had the right to ask for this moment. I paused, my hands frozen mid-fold, and for a moment, I considered turning him away, pretending I didn't hear him, that everything could go back to how it was before. But something in his voice, in the way he stood there, not pushing but waiting for permission, made me nod slowly. "Close the door," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him, and we were alone again. The air between us felt thick, like we had been waiting for this moment to happen, like the universe had been holding its breath, waiting for us to finally face the unspoken truths between us. "I don't know how to act around you anymore," Ethan admitted, his voice raw, the vulnerability in his words mama day heartache in ways I couldn't understand. His face was a mixture of guilt and longing, eyes searching mine for a sign, for some sort of answer that would either ease the tension or permit him to keep going. I took a deep breath, struggling to steady myself. "Ethan, we have to let this go," I said, my voice trembling, betraying the war raging inside me. It was a moment, nothing more. But as the words left my mouth, I knew they were a lie. It wasn't just a moment. It couldn't be, because it wasn't only him who was caught up in this, and I could no longer pretend otherwise. His eyes darkened, and he stepped closer, closing the gap between us in a way that felt almost predestined, like the space between us had been shrinking for days, months even. "At least not for me," he whispered, and my chest tightened painfully. The weight of his admission settled in the pit of my stomach. The truth hung between us, thick and undeniable, the unsaid words now echoing in my mind. I had felt it too, since the very first time our hands brushed in the hallway, or when he lingered in the kitchen, talking to me like we shared something more than just polite conversation. Those small moments had built up until I couldn't ignore them anymore. There comes a point, I realized, when you know you're about to cross a line, and once you do, there's no going back. I had felt it then, even before the first kiss, before everything unraveled. But it wasn't until that kiss, when Ethan's lips met mine for the first time, that I truly understood what had been happening. It wasn't planned. None of it was. It just happened. And in that moment, as his hands gently cupped my face, I knew I was falling into something I couldn't control. It had started so innocently. Mark had gone out for his usual poker night with his golf buddies, leaving me alone in the house. I'd been wiping down the kitchen counters, lost in my thoughts, trying to push the gnawing uncertainty about everything to the back of my mind. But then, Ethan had walked in barefoot, his hair tousled like he'd just woken up. His presence filled the room, and the silence between us was thick with something unspoken. "Can't sleep?" I asked, glancing over at him as I continued with the task at hand, pretending like nothing was wrong. "Something like that," he said, his voice low, and I could hear the tension in it, something I couldn't name, but that made my pulse quicken regardless. He leaned against the doorway, watching me in a way that made my skin tingle. I was suddenly acutely aware of every movement, every breath. The hum of the refrigerator in the background was the only sound, but it felt like it might be the loudest thing in the room. We stood there in that silence, the space between us charged with 1,000 unspoken words. And when I finally dared to look up at him, the intensity of his gaze stole the breath from my lungs. His eyes were darker now, more intensely, like he was waiting for me to acknowledge whatever was building between us. "Claire," he said softly, his voice a whisper, yet it reverberated through me. "Ethan, don't," I whispered, even as my heart rate spiked, my body betraying me in ways I couldn't explain. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, to tell him that this was wrong, that we couldn't go any further. But my voice faltered, and the distance between us seemed to shrink with every passing second. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his words slow but sure, like they were something he'd been carrying for a while, something that was finally spilling out. My breath hitched. "You have to," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but the conviction was there, even as the words didn't match the way my body was reacting to him. "This is wrong. You know that." "I know," he said, and there was a strange resignation in his voice, as though he was fully aware of the consequences but couldn't stop himself. And then, before I could say anything else, he closed the distance between us completely and kissed me. It was tentative at first, a careful brushing of lips, as though he was waiting for me to pull away, to stop him. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was a desperation in that kiss, a pleading I couldn't ignore. His hands rested lightly on my shoulders, and mine found their way to his chest, as though we were both trying to anchor ourselves in the face of something we knew was dangerous, yet so impossible to resist. When we finally pulled away, my chest was heaving, and my heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. I couldn't meet his eyes, afraid of what I would see there, afraid of what it would mean. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice shaking, but even as the words left me, I knew they were futile. I wasn't sure I even believed them myself. He nodded, but his eyes, those eyes that had once been full of uncertainty, now looked determined, as though he knew that what we'd just shared was something we couldn't walk away from. Not really. "I know," he said softly, his voice full of understanding, but also an undeniable sadness. as if he knew that the consequences of this moment would follow us for a long time. The look in his eyes, the way his lips lingered in that brief moment after the kiss, it told me everything I needed to know. He didn't believe it either. Neither of us did. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and quiet desperation. Each passing hour filled with the tension of something we both knew we shouldn't be doing, but couldn't stop. We tried, desperately tried, to pretend that nothing had changed, that we were just two people living in the same house, unaware of the current pulling us inextricably together. But every glance, every accidental brush of skin, felt charged with a silent energy that neither of us could deny. It was like walking a tightrope, always aware of the fall, but unable to stop moving forward. Mark remained blissfully unaware. His focus split between work, his friends, and the never-ending hobbies that kept him busy in the evenings. It was as if he was completely absorbed in his world, oblivious to the subtle shift that had occurred in ours. But even as he remained distracted by his routines, I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that we were playing with fire, with something so dangerous that one wrong move could burn us both. The second time it happened was in the garden, a place I had always found solace. I had spent the morning pruning the roses, the warm sun pressing down on my back, the scent of the blooms filling the air, when I heard his voice behind me. "You're always out here," Ethan said, his words breaking the quiet stillness that had surrounded me. I didn't turn around right away, afraid of what I might see in his face, afraid of what it might make me feel. "It's peaceful," I replied, keeping my focus on the task at hand, my hands moving methodically through the tangled branches. But I could feel him, just behind me, his presence a constant pull on my attention. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across the flowers, casting everything in a darker light. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 3 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. "I think you like avoiding me," he said, the words laced with something that made my breath catch in my chest. I forced myself to stay calm, my heart hammering in my throat. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice much steadier than I felt. "Don't you?" he asked again, softer now, but still insistent. His tone was both a question and a challenge, one I couldn't ignore. Slowly, I turned to face him, my chest tight as I met his gaze. And this time there was no hesitation. No moment where I could convince myself to walk away. He kissed me again, and this time I kissed him back. There was no turning back now. The floodgates had opened, and whatever fragile barrier had existed between us shattered in the heat of that kiss. The world fell away, leaving just the two of us at that moment, caught up in something neither of us could fully comprehend but couldn't resist either. What began as fleeting moments quickly spiraled into something neither of us could control. At first, we were careful, finding quiet corners of the house where we wouldn't be interrupted, places where we could touch, speak, and exist in the intimacy we had created without the constant threat of discovery. But the more time we spent together, the bolder we became, unable to resist the pull of the forbidden. One evening, while Mark was out at a client dinner, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the library. I had been pretending to organize the shelves, but my hands were trembling with the need to be near him, to feel him close again. The quiet in the room was almost suffocating, and I could hear the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Ethan stood just behind me, his presence so near I could feel the warmth of his body even without touching him. "You're shaking," he murmured, his breath warm against my neck. The softness of his voice and the tenderness in his touch made me ache in ways I hadn't expected. "I'm fine," I replied, but even I could hear the lie in my voice. His hand slid gently onto my shoulders, turning me to face him, his gaze steady, searching mine. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly, and there was an understanding in his words that made everything inside me twist. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but I could feel the lie hanging between us. The truth was I was afraid, not of him, but of what we were doing. The guilt, the betrayal, the potential destruction of everything we had. Those were the things that terrified me. He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but insistent, and for a brief moment, I let myself feel the weight of his gaze. Then stop thinking about it, he murmured. Just be with me. And in that moment, I couldn't fight it anymore. I couldn't tell him we couldn't keep doing this. Couldn't say the words that might stop this madness. Instead, I let him pull me into his arms, and for the first time in years, I felt alive in a way I hadn't realized I had been starving for. Every inch of me, every nerve, seemed to awaken under his touch, and for a moment, it was as if everything else, the life I had settled for, the quiet, the routine, disappeared. The secrecy of our relationship only fueled the intensity. Every stolen moment, every touch in the dark, felt like a rebellion against the life I had settled into. It was as though we were both carving out a space for ourselves, a space where passion and desire still existed, hidden beneath the weight of years and expectations. But with that thrill came the fear of being found out, the fear of the inevitable consequences that would follow. It was a double-edged sword, and each time we crossed a line, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer we could keep it hidden. One afternoon, as Ethan and I sat on the couch in the living room, the door creaked open, and Mark's voice called out from the hallway. "Claire!" he shouted, his voice sounding unusually loud against the quiet of the house. I froze, my heart jumping into my throat. My pulse quickened, and I scrambled to make myself look composed as Ethan quickly moved to the opposite side of the room, his face a mask of calm, though I could see the tension in his shoulders. "In here," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady despite the panic threatening to rise in my chest. I knew I had to act normal, but everything felt off kilter now. Mark walked in, his gaze flicking between the two of us, his eyes lingering on Ethan for a moment longer than usual. "Didn't realize you'd have company," he said, his tone casual. But there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. His gaze was sharp, assessing. "Just catching up," Ethan said smoothly, his posture relaxed, his voice even. I forced a smile, but my stomach churned with the overwhelming sense that we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't control, and Mark, oblivious as always, was the only one who didn't know. Mark nodded, but the way he looked at me as he walked away sent a shiver down my spine. It was like a flicker of suspicion had ignited, and no matter how careful we were, the cracks in our secret were starting to show. It became harder to hide the truth, even though we tried to keep everything under wraps. Mark began asking questions, subtle at first, but with time, they became more pointed. "You and Ethan seem to be getting along well," he remarked one evening as we sat at the dinner table, his eyes scanning both of us in turn, as though weighing the tension in the room. "He's been a big help around the house," I replied, forcing a smile, trying to keep my voice light and casual. My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept my gaze fixed on my plate. Mark nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made my stomach twist. "I'm glad to see that," he said, almost too casually. "It's good to know someone's keeping you company while I'm busy." His words were laced with something I couldn't quite place, a flicker of doubt, a hint of something darker, and I felt the blood drain from my face. It was as if he had suspected something, but he wasn't ready to confront it yet. The tension in the air thickened, and I found myself wishing I could disappear. The first real crack came when Ethan's best friend, Grant, showed up unannounced one afternoon. Grant was loud, opinionated, and had a knack for picking up on things others tried to hide. He was the type of person who could make a joke and still make you feel like you were being scrutinized, and today he was doing just that. "You've been spending a lot of time at home," Grant remarked to Ethan, his tone light, but his eyes sharp, scanning the room like he was trying to piece something together. "Just helping out," Ethan replied casually, trying to downplay the situation, but his body language betrayed him. Stiff, tense, always on alert. "Must be nice," Grant said, his gaze flicking to me, then back to Ethan. "Having someone to keep you company." The comment sent a chill down my spine. My stomach churned, and I quickly excused myself from the room, desperate to get away from the sudden weight of the conversation. Later, Ethan found me in the kitchen, his expression tight with worry. "Grant knows something," he said quietly, his voice laced with tension. "He's guessing," I replied, though my voice wavered under the pressure. I wanted to believe that, wanted to convince myself it was just a harmless remark. But deep down, I knew Grant wasn't stupid. And the more he talked, the more the walls around our secret began to crack. Ethan shook his head, his eyes dark with concern. He's not stupid. He's going to figure it out. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the house grew unbearable. Mark's suspicions were mounting, Grant's remarks were becoming more pointed, and the weight of our secret felt heavier with each passing day. I could feel it, the impending storm, the sense that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But even as the risks grew, so did my feelings for Ethan. And no matter how dangerous it became, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. Keeping a secret like this is like holding your breath underwater. You can only do it for so long before the pressure starts to crush you. Ethan and I were good at hiding, but the cracks in our facade were growing wider with each passing day. Mark wasn't stupid, and neither was Grant. We were running out of time, and I felt like I was suffocating. And then there was Heather. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 4 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Heather, Mark's colleague, seemed to have a talent for turning casual visits into something far more intrusive. She had been to the house a few times before, always under the pretense of dropping something off for Mark, but this time felt different. It wasn't a friendly drop-in. It was an unannounced visit, one that reeked of ulterior motives. One Saturday afternoon, I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, trying to focus on the task at hand, when I heard the sound of the door opening. Heather walked in, her smile wide, but too bright, too knowing. "I thought I'd stop by," she said, as though she had every right to be there. "Mark mentioned you've been feeling a little overwhelmed lately. I figured you could use a distraction." "I'm fine," I replied quickly, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "But thank you." Heather placed the bottle of wine she was holding on the counter and leaned against the island, her gaze sweeping across the room with a quiet intensity that made me uncomfortable. She seemed to be cataloging every detail, as if trying to see beneath the surface. "This place is gorgeous," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "You've done such a good job making it feel like a home." "Thank you," I said tightly, my grip on the knife handle tightening. My skin prickled with unease as she continued to look around, but I did my best to remain calm. Her gaze lingered on the back door where Ethan had walked out only moments before. I could feel the weight of her eyes on me as she spoke again, her voice now laced with something knowing, something predatory. "Mark's lucky to have you. And Ethan, of course. He's such a big help around here, isn't he?" My heart skipped a beat, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. Every instinct screamed at me to protect the secret, to deny it, but I kept my expression neutral. "He's been great," I replied, my voice even, though inside I was fighting to keep the panic at bay. "It's nice having him around." Heather's lips curved into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. The smile was too knowing, too calculated, and I could feel the weight of it bearing down on me. "I bet it is," she said softly, the implication in her voice hanging in the air like a silent accusation. I didn't know what to say, how to defend myself. The pressure of keeping everything hidden was starting to suffocate me, and I knew Heather was far from oblivious. She was playing her game, and I had no idea how long it would take before her suspicions turned into something far more dangerous. The walls were closing in, and soon, I feared, there would be nowhere left to hide. As the weeks went on, Heather's presence at the house grew more frequent, each visit a little more intrusive than the last. She found new excuses to stop by, all conveniently tied to work or casual drop-ins. But the underlying motive was always the same. She was fishing for something. I couldn't tell whether it was information she was after or if she was trying to latch on a Mark in some subtle, almost insidious way. One afternoon, we were sitting together in the living room, sipping tea, when she dropped a comment that made my stomach churn. "You know," she said casually, her voice smooth but sharp beneath the surface. "Mark doesn't talk much about his personal life, but I get the sense that things haven't been perfect between you two." I stiffened, feeling the heat rush to my face as I gripped the teacup in my lap. "Every marriage has its challenges, of course," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, but my heart was pounding in my chest. Heather's lips twisted into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But I'm sure it helps Hato having around. He seems attentive." The way she said it, so offhand, so deliberately, left no room for misinterpretation. She knew. She suspected. And it made my pulse race with fear. Was she trying to catch me off guard? To see how I would respond? I forced myself to keep the conversation casual. But inside, panic was clawing at my chest. How much did she know? How much could I risk? It wasn't just Heather, though. The pressure was mounting from all sides. Grant, Ethan's best friend, had always been blunt, often to the point of rudeness, but now his comments carried an edge that made my skin crawl. "You've been spending a lot of time with Claire," he remarked one evening, as he and Ethan sat on the patio, beers in hand. Ethan shrugged, trying to keep it light. "She's my stepmom. Of course, we're going to talk." Grant didn't let it go. "Yeah, but it's not just that, is it?" His eyes were sharp, cutting through the casualness of the moment like a blade. Ethan's grip on his bottle tightened, his body going rigid. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying you're acting weird," Grant said bluntly, his gaze piercing. "And I don't think it's just because of the job stuff. There's something else going on, and I think it involves her." Ethan stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped harshly against the stone. "You don't know what you're talking about." Grant didn't back down. His eyes narrowed, a knowing look creeping into his expression. "Don't I?" The tension between them could have cut the air with a knife, and I could practically feel it from where I stood inside. My stomach twisted in knots. Ethan's frustration was simmering beneath the surface, and I feared it was only a matter of time before he cracked. The tension in the house grew unbearable, like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. Every interaction with Mark felt like I was walking a tightrope, trying to balance between normalcy and the chaos I was desperately trying to hide. Every visit from Heather felt like a test I was destined to fail. And Ethan? Ethan was growing bolder, more impatient. The secrecy that had once fueled our connection now felt like a noose, tightening with every passing day. One evening, we were alone in the library, a quiet space where we had spent countless hours together in stolen moments. Ethan turned to me, his expression hard, his jaw tight with frustration. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low but resolute. I looked at him, my throat tightening. "Ethan, we have to be careful," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We can't keep going like this. Careful isn't enough anymore," he shot back, his tone growing sharper, the frustration in his eyes unmistakable. Grant's suspicious, Heather sniffing around, and Mark's not as clueless as you think. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, my voice breaking. He moved closer, his hand gently cupping my cheek. "I'm saying we need to stop." His voice softened, but there was a deep, underlying tension in his words. "I know you don't want to, but we need to figure out what we're going to do, because this..." He paused, taking a deep breath, his eyes dark with conflict. "This isn't sustainable." My chest tightened as the weight of his words settled in. I wanted to argue, to deny it, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew he was right. It couldn't go on like this. But the thought of walking away, of ending what had become something so all-consuming, was unimaginable. And yet, the consequences of continuing were even worse. The breaking point came during a dinner party Mark insisted on hosting. It was meant to be a celebration, a casual evening with friends and colleagues. But the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Heather was there, of course, as was Grant, and Mark's colleagues filled the house with polite conversation and clinking wine glasses. On the surface, everything seemed perfectly fine, like a picture-perfect evening. But as the night wore on, something shifted. The tension in the room thickened. "So, Claire," Heather said, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. "How do you keep yourself occupied with Mark gone so often?" I froze, the question hanging in the air like a trap, its implications undeniable. The blood drained from my face as I felt the weight of everyone's eyes on me, a sudden spotlight shining too brightly on a secret that was no longer so well hidden. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 5 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. My mind raced. How could I answer? How much could I lie before it became obvious? But before I could gather my thoughts, the room seemed to grow silent, the walls closing in. I was cornered, and no matter how I tried to spin it, I knew the truth would come out. It had to. That was when I realized The night had just turned into something more than just a dinner party. It had become the beginning of the end. The tension in the garden was palpable, thick, and suffocating as Mark's gaze locked on us, each of his words a strike in the quiet, fragile moment. I felt the weight of the truth pressing against my chest, but I couldn't find the courage to say anything that might shatter the delicate, barely held together facade we had managed to create. The night, which had already been so full of veiled threats and half-spoken accusations, had just become something else entirely, a confrontation I had feared but could no longer avoid. Mark stood there, unmoving, as though waiting for one of us to break. His eyes were dark, sharp with the kind of quiet rage that could easily tear everything apart. My heart was pounding in my chest, a deafening sound that drowned out the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the party still going on inside. "Mark," I said, my voice wavering despite my best efforts to stay composed. "We were just talking." His laugh was cold, cutting through the still night air like a blade. "Talking? Funny how you two seem to have so much to talk about these days," he said, his words biting into the fragile silence. Ethan stood his ground, but I could see his muscles tense, his posture rigid with the struggle to hold his composure. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice low but sharp, challenging Mark's insinuation. Mark's smile was anything but friendly. "I don't know, Ethan. Should there be?" His words were laced with something darker now, a knowing, a certainty that made the air between us crackle with unspoken truths. It was like a trap had snapped shut around us. I could see it in Mark's eyes. He wasn't asking questions anymore. He wasn't pretending. He knew. He knew. My mind raced, but my body felt frozen, like I was watching from the outside as everything I had tried so desperately to keep hidden unraveled before me. This wasn't just suspicion. This was a realization. Mark had seen something, heard something, or maybe even put together the pieces he'd been too afraid to acknowledge before. Either way, the game was over. "I think I'll head inside," Ethan muttered, his voice strained but firm, as though he still believed he could escape this. But Mark's next words stopped him cold. "No," Mark snapped, his voice like a whip. "You'll stay right here." There was no room for negotiation in that tone. Ethan didn't move. Neither of us did. I felt the weight of the silence pressing on me. The words left unsaid, stretching between us like an invisible barrier I couldn't cross. The finality of Mark's command hung in the air, thick and suffocating. This was it. There was no pretending anymore. Mark's eyes shifted back to me, dark and unreadable, like a storm just waiting to break. "What's going on, Claire?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. But there was a sharpness behind it, something that promised consequences, something that made me want to shrink away from his gaze. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. How could I possibly explain? How could I possibly justify the mess I had created? The destruction of trust that had once seemed so unshakable. The garden, once a peaceful refuge, now felt like a battlefield. Ethan and I stood there, together yet so far apart, each of us silently understanding the same thing. The truth had caught up to us, and there was no escaping the consequences. The silence stretched unbearable and thick until finally I broke it, though I wasn't sure what I was saying anymore. I don't know what you want me to say, Mark." My voice was trembling, but I couldn't stop it. "Ethan and I, we've been talking, but there's nothing going on that you need to worry about." It sounded weak, pathetic, even like I was trying to convince myself as much as him. Mark didn't respond immediately, his gaze narrowing as though weighing every word, every breath. And then, without warning, he stepped closer, his presence looming over me, forcing me to confront him. "I do worry, Claire," he said, his voice low but thick with anger. "I worry when the people I trust start hiding things from me. I worry when things stop adding up." The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't just angry, he was hurt, and there was nothing I could do to fix it. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quiet, but the tension in his tone was unmistakable. "We didn't mean for this to happen," he said, as though explaining, but there was no way to make it sound innocent now. "I didn't mean to come between you two." Mark's eyes flicked to Ethan, cold and calculating, but it wasn't just suspicion in them anymore. It was a disappointment, deep, cutting hurt that I could feel in my chest. "You're not coming between us," he said, his voice tight. "She's been hiding things from me." I flinched, but there was no denying the truth of his words. "You need to leave, Ethan," Mark said, his voice steady now, but it was final. "I think you've done enough for today." Ethan hesitated for a moment, as if he were debating whether to say something, to fight back, but in the end, he only nodded stiffly. He turned and walked away without another word, disappearing into the house as I stood there, frozen in the garden with Mark's piercing gaze still fixed on me. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how to fix any of this. But I knew one thing. Whatever had been between Ethan and me, whatever fragile thread of connection we had, was gone now. And the consequences of our actions were just beginning to unfold. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ethan's face flushed with anger, his fists clenching at his sides as Mark's cold gaze never wavered. I sat there, frozen, unable to speak. The weight of the moment crushed the air from my lungs, and I could feel the sharp divide between the two men, each so determined in their own right, each unwilling to back down. "This is my house," Mark repeated, the statement carrying finality in every syllable. "And I won't tolerate this anymore." Ethan's jaw tightened, and for a long, agonizing moment, it seemed like neither of them would move. Mark's words hung over the table like an executioner's axe, swift and unyielding, while Ethan's anger simmered just below the surface, threatening to boil over. "I'm not leaving, not like this," Ethan said, his voice low, but the tension in it was unmistakable. "You have a week," Mark said, the edge of finality in his voice a sharp contrast to Ethan's defiance. "Use it wisely." Ethan turned on his heel, his chair scraping violently against the floor as he stormed out of the room. I stayed still, not knowing if I should follow him or stay and face Mark. My heart pounded, but the truth was clear now. Everything I'd been trying to protect was crumbling. The walls I had built around our secret, around the fragile balance we had tried to maintain, were collapsing faster than I could comprehend. Mark watched me, his gaze cold and unwavering. "So, what's it going to be, Claire?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Are you with me, or are you choosing him?" I couldn't answer him. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because at that moment, the choice felt so much bigger than I could articulate. Ethan had become more than just an escape, more than a secret. But Mark was my husband, the man I had pledged to stand by. Could I tear apart everything I had built with him for something that felt so dangerous, so uncertain? Mark leaned back in his chair, watching me with an intensity that seemed to pierce through me. "You know, I thought we had a good marriage, Claire," he said, his voice tinged with something like disappointment, though it was difficult to tell if it was real or just an act. "But I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when I see you sneaking around behind my back." His words cut deeper than I had expected. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about me, and everything I had failed to see until now. The cracks in the foundation of my marriage, the lies that had built up over time, and the trust that had shattered in a way that felt irreparable. "I never meant for this to happen," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I didn't know what else to say. I couldn't defend myself, couldn't justify the mess I had made. I had allowed this, all of this, to happen, and now there was no going back. Mark's gaze softened for just a fraction of a second, but it quickly hardened again. "I want you to think about this carefully, Claire. You're playing with fire. Do you think Ethan's going to be there for you when it all falls apart? He's not. He never will be. He's just using you, just like you're using him. But I'm the one who's been here, who's built this life with you." His words, though laced with anger, carried an unsettling truth to them. I had been using Ethan, hadn't I? Not consciously, but in the way that we all find comfort in something we know is wrong because it feels right in the moment. But was that enough to destroy everything? I didn't say anything, couldn't say anything. The reality of what I had done, the choices I had made, felt like a lead weight sinking deeper and deeper into my chest. "I'll give you time to think," Mark said, standing up from the table. "But don't take too long. The decision's yours, Claire. I just hope you make the right one." He walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the remnants of the evening, the tension, and the impossible choices that loomed like a dark cloud above me. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It wasn't just about Mark either. It was about me, and what kind of person I was willing to become to preserve what I had, or to give it all up for something that felt like a fleeting escape. But as I sat there, the silence pressing in around me, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep running from the truth forever. My blood ran cold at her words. "I'll handle the timing." It was the kind of threat that didn't need to be loud to be terrifying. It hung between us, thick with the promise of something inevitable, something destructive. I took a step back, still clutching the note in my hand, trying to steady my breath to make sense of the storm that had just been unleashed. Heather, with her perfect smile and her sharp edges, was playing a game I hadn't been prepared for. And now, the stakes were higher than I ever imagined. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 6 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. "You won't get away with this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but fierce, full of the desperation that had been building inside me for weeks. Heather's eyes gleamed with a cold satisfaction. "Oh, Claire, I don't need to get away with anything. The truth has a way of making itself known, don't you think?" Before I could respond, I heard Mark's footsteps approaching. I glanced at the doorway, panic rising in my chest. Heather straightened, smoothing her blouse, and then, as if on cue, she placed the most innocent smile on her face, as though nothing had transpired between us. Mark stepped into the kitchen just as I was about to speak, his gaze flicking between the two of us, his eyes narrowing when he saw the note still clutched in my hand. He didn't need to ask what it was. The tension in the room said it all. "What's going on here?" Mark's voice was calm, almost too calm, but there was an edge beneath it that made my heart race. I turned to him, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is about Heather's game. She's trying to manipulate us, Mark." "She?" "Oh, Claire," Heather interrupted, her voice sugary sweet. "Don't be dramatic. I'm simply making sure that everything is out in the open." Her eyes flicked to Mark, then back to me. "No more secrets, right?" I saw Mark's expression shift, something flickering in his eyes. But before I could say anything more, Heather stepped forward. "Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. Claire and Ethan have been hiding their relationship from you for far too long. I think you deserve to know the truth." I could feel the blood draining from my face, and the world around me beginning to tilt. This was it. Heather had the power now. The weight of her words settled heavily in the air between us, suffocating any argument or defense I might have had. She had set the trap, and I had no way of avoiding the fall. Mark didn't say anything for a long moment. He simply stared at me, his face unreadable. Then he turned to Heather, his voice low and strained. "Is this true?" I opened my mouth to deny it, to protect what was left of my fractured marriage, but the words stuck in my throat. Heather's smirk widened, and in that instant, I knew there was no way to salvage this. Not with Mark, not with Ethan, not with any of it. "You should ask your wife," Heather said, her tone smooth, almost patronizing. "She's the one with the answers." Mark's gaze didn't leave me, the weight of it pressing on my chest. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was suffocating under the intensity of his scrutiny. "Claire?" Mark's voice was sharp now, his patience wearing thin. "Answer me." I took a shaky breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that there was no turning back. The decision had already been made. I had been living on borrowed time, and now, everything was about to come crashing down. With the tension in the air thick enough to choke on, I finally spoke. "Yes, it's true. Ethan and we've been close. Closer than we should have been." Mark's face went ashen, and for a moment, I thought I saw something close to pain flicker in his eyes. But it was gone so quickly that I couldn't be sure. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. "You have 1 minute," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Get out." I didn't move. I couldn't. Part of me wanted to run to Ethan, to beg him to fix this, to take me away from the wreckage I had created. But that wasn't an option anymore. I had no escape. Mark's eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the finality in them. The decision was made. He had chosen. There was no room for negotiation. No more false promises. His words landed like a death sentence, final and absolute. "This marriage is over," he said, his voice breaking the silence with cruel finality. My knees nearly buckled under the weight of those words, and it felt as though everything I had known had slipped from under me. But deep down, part of me already knew this was coming. This was the price of the choices I had made. Heather's soft laughter filled the space as she watched, her role as the catalyst now complete. She had orchestrated this moment perfectly, knowing exactly how to pull the strings. "You'll regret this," I whispered, the last bit of defiance still burning in my chest. But I knew it wasn't going to change anything. It was too late for regret. The damage was done. Mark didn't even look at me. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there with the shattered pieces of my life scattered around me. Heather smiled, satisfied with the destruction she had caused. "You'll see," she said softly, her voice dripping with triumph. "You'll see just how much you've lost." As the sound of Mark's footsteps faded into the distance, I realized that everything I had fought to protect had been swept away. The game was over, and I was left with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat. The urgency in Ethan's voice made my pulse quicken. His words hung in the air like a ticking bomb, each second of silence adding to the weight of what we were facing. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "We can't let her control this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to think carefully. If Mark finds out..." Ethan squeezed my hand, cutting me off. "If Mark finds out, everything is over. But if Heather is the one to tell him, it'll be worse. She'll make sure he hates me. And you..." His eyes burned with intensity. "She's playing a dangerous game, Claire, and I don't know how long we have before she pulls the trigger." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, a mix of dread and helplessness. My life had been spiraling out of control for weeks, and now, with Heather in the picture, I was caught between two men. One who wanted to control every aspect of my life, and the other who had already crossed a line that could destroy everything. It felt like there was no way out, no clean way to fix this. "Do you think Mark will believe her?" I asked, my voice strained. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know, but I know Mark, Claire. He's not stupid. If Heather pushes him enough, he'll start seeing what he wants to see. And if he does, I don't think I'll get a chance to explain myself." I pulled my hand back, running my fingers through my hair in frustration. "Then what do we do? We can't just let her win." Ethan's face softened, the hard edge in his expression melting into something almost tender. "We fight back. Together." The words seemed to echo in my mind, and for the briefest moment, I allowed myself to imagine a different life. One where I wasn't living in the chaos of secrets and lies. One where I wasn't caught between the past and the future, between duty and desire. But reality crashed back in almost instantly. "How?" I whispered. "What can we even do? We're both at her mercy." Ethan looked at me, his gaze unwavering, as if he were searching for something in me, something he could cling to. "We take control. We don't wait for her to make the first move. If Heather's going to expose everything, we need to be the ones to tell Mark first. But we need to be prepared. We can't go in unarmed. Not now." I nodded, a mix of dread and resolve settling over me. "You're right. If we don't take the initiative, we'll lose before we even start." Ethan's expression darkened again, his jaw tightening. "There's one more thing you need to know. Heather is already making moves. She's trying to turn Mark against you, Claire. I don't think she's done with this." I could feel my heart pounding harder in my chest. "What do you mean? What is she planning?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting away. Then, in a low voice, he said, "She's already told him things. Little things, nothing concrete, but enough to plant doubt. Enough to make Mark question you. She's making him see things that aren't there." I felt the blood drain from my face as the full weight of what Ethan was saying hit me. "She's already poisoning him," I whispered, my voice shaking. "She's trying to break us apart." Ethan nodded grimly. "And if we don't stop her now, she'll finish what she started." For a moment, we stood there in the quiet of the park, the cold air biting at our skin. The world around us felt distant, like it was fading into the background while we stood at the center of a storm we couldn't control. Ethan took a step forward, his face determined. We need to act fast. Mark's already suspicious. If we wait too long, he'll make his choice. And I'm afraid it won't be you. My stomach churned at the thought, but I knew he was right. Mark was already slipping away. And if Heather had her way, I'd lose him for good. But what was the alternative? If we confronted Mark now, everything would come out into the open. The lies, the secrets, the hurt. Could we survive that? Could Mark? How do we even start? I asked, feeling a wave of exhaustion crash over me. How do we fight back against someone like Heather? Ethan took my hand again, his grip firm and reassuring. We go to him, Claire. We tell him everything. No more lies. No more games. It's the only way to take away Heather's power. If we let her control the narrative, we lose. But if we control the truth, we might still have a chance. I looked into Ethan's eyes, the resolve in his face reflected in mine. This was the moment, the choice we had to make, whether we were ready for it or not. We couldn't run anymore. The only way forward was through the storm. Okay, I said, my voice steady now, a fire igniting deep inside me. Let's do it. Together. Ethan gave me a small, tight smile. Together, as we stood there by the bridge, the world felt like it was on the edge of shattering. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like we might just have a chance to rebuild the pieces if we were brave enough to face the truth head on. And in that moment, I knew I was willing to fight for whatever was left. Whatever we could have, despite everything. As we wrap up today's story, it's clear that we've explored some deep, emotional struggles. Tensions between trust, control, and the consequences of our choices. What's at stake here isn't just family secrets, but the very relationships that define us. So, what have we learned from this intense journey? Maybe it's that sometimes the truth must come out, even when it's painful. Or perhaps it's the reminder that honesty and vulnerability can be the ultimate tools in reclaiming control of our lives and relationships. But what do you think? I want to hear from you. What's one thing you've learned from this story that you can apply to your own life? Whether it's about standing up for yourself, confronting difficult truths, or taking charge of a situation before it spirals. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Your support means the world, and we'll be back soon with more stories that will make you think, reflect, and grow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.